Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 83, The Death of Marshal, Prince, and King Murat. Before we begin, if you like this podcast, I recommend you follow our YouTube page. Please go to youtube.com and then search Generals and Napoleon Podcast. Once you find it, please hit the subscribe button. There are over 80 videos posted there now, some of which you cannot find anywhere else. As always, we thank you for your support. Now, on with the show. I have a fantastic guest all the way from London on the line tonight. We have Jonathan North. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi there. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Thanks so much for doing this.
It's a pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, for sure. For those of you not familiar with Jonathan, he's an author of 12 books, which you can find on jpnorth.co.uk, but mostly around the Napoleonic period, correct?
That's absolutely right. And I put a lot of other stuff on the website too that doesn't get published because it's quite obscure, but I find it interesting and you might find it interesting too.
Yeah, and as my listeners may as well. So I recommend they all check that out. Yeah. And Jonathan's newest book, which I'm very intrigued by, it's called The Death of Murat. It was obviously the great Marshal of Napoleon, Prince of the Empire, and King of Naples. What kind of brought you to focus on Marshal Murat?
Well, I think John is a really interesting character, and I think he's generally quite characterized as being rather brash and colorful and a bit simple, galloping around the battlefields of Europe. And I felt that was a little bit of an injustice for what actually is quite a complex figure. He's a very Napoleonic figure in a way. And I was drawn to him mostly, I have to say, because of what happened to him at the end of his life rather than at the beginning. In a way, his career is, like I say, quite typically Napoleonic. He has a very humble background, rises up through the ranks, gets noticed by Napoleon, gets promoted, becomes duke, becomes king. In those days, it's true, not many people had that successful career like that, but he's one of those in that select group who followed that trajectory. But it's his end, really, that I found the most dramatic. I mean, obviously he's there on battlefields in Europe, in Germany, Austria, Russia. That's dramatic enough. But I found that the rather sad and shambolic expedition he mounted in 1815 to try and win back his throne had all the ingredients of a little drama as part of a bigger drama.
Yeah, and you're right. It's almost overshadowed by Napoleon's failure that same year. Was Murat's attempt to regain his throne. But we'll jump into that.
Yeah, I think that there's a very good point, John. I think that Napoleon's surprise return to France and regaining his throne, Murat tries something similar. But like you said, we'll come to that and how it wasn't like that at all and how badly it went wrong.
Yeah, that's a good teaser for the end of our episode. But yeah, let's kind of talk about his background. He rose to fame as an innkeeper's son all the way to the King of Naples. I know many people say he wasn't that bright, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. There's a famous quote from General Swaggering that says he wishes Murat had less courage and more common sense. Yeah. What's your kind of quick overview of the man?
Well, I'm definitely agreeing with Swaggering that had a lot of courage. Courage was very much his defining quality. But you don't get to rise up through the ranks and sort of climb that greasy pole without other talents. So I think it's a bit dismissive to say he was just a brave soldier. There are plenty of brave soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars who don't achieve what Murat achieved. So I would say that it's a meteoric rise. He was son of an innkeeper down there in the southwest of France. Looked like he was destined for the church at one point, but I mean, who thought that was a good idea? Just look at him. Instead, he ran away, joined the army before the revolution. He was already in the cavalry, and he was already womanizing and fighting duels and falling out and things like that. But it's really when the revolution comes that he hitches his star to the republic, and at that point, his turn in fortune occurs, and he starts rising up. I mean, you've got to say the right things to the right people at that time, and I think he was very good at doing that. You can see in his letters and correspondence that there is a political Murat. He kind of manages the different pressures, and let's say plenty of his contemporaries didn't do that at all, ended up being guillotined or went off into exile. But he found his way through. And then I think the big change is when he meets Napoleon.
Yeah, I always find it interesting that his contemporaries, meaning the other generals and marshals, didn't really like him because he was kind of higher up than them because he was married to Napoleon's sister.
Yeah.
But it almost seemed like he didn't care that they didn't like him. He was just like, whatever, I'm Murat, deal with it.
Yeah. No, I think there's definitely an ego at work. I think you can't look at a painting of Murat and say, there's a modest, there's a modest person. His dash and flamboyance and panache is definitely linked to self-confidence. I mean, perhaps too much. So I can also see why he wasn't popular. He's like the showy kid at school. Show off. Nobody else really likes him. But like I say, I think there is a bit of a savvy political operator who knew what to say to the right people to really cement his position at any point in time. And you're right that the marriage is important, but it's not just that.
Yeah. And like any good cavalryman, he had a good knack for timing. And I'll give you a few examples. I like to point out the number of times that Murat really helped Napoleon's career. The first time was 1795, Vendemiaire, and retrieving the cannons to put down the Paris uprising with the whiff of grape shot, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely there, the right person at the right time. It's one of those historical moments where those two men come together, and there's a partnership there that whether it's gratitude, whether it's just recognizing each other's talents, I'm not sure. But at that point, Murat and Napoleon sort of form a little team. Murat becomes Napoleon's aide-de-camp for the campaign in Italy, 1796. And from that point on, he's really a companion all the way through. And you're absolutely right. There are some key moments where Napoleon is saved by Murat's ability to handle. I think this is the point: the ability to handle large numbers of cavalry effectively at the right time, the right place, and bring them to bear. And again, it's the charisma thing. He had this ability to lead people, to motivate people. I'm not going to talk about Ridley Scott, but one of the things in that film that really annoyed me was the complete lack of any kind of charisma in Napoleon and his circle. Napoleon's circle was full of charismatic people. They knew. I mean, you're not going to risk your life for these people unless you think it's a good idea.
Right. And Murat, you think, is the most Hollywood of all the marshals, and he wasn't even in the movie.
I know. I mean, they didn't have the budget for the costume. I think that was probably what it was.
Maybe that's it. That's it. Well, going back to his career, his timing is good. In Egypt, I know he helps win a huge battle on the beaches there.
Yeah.
And then in 1799, Napoleon's successful coup for power, Murat's grenadiers kind of help him take over the legislature there. So, again, always by his future brother-in-law's side to help him win victory.
Absolutely. Always there, always ready, always willing, always enthusiastic.
Yep.
A really good subordinate in that sense.
Yeah, in 1807, the great cavalry charge at Eylau.
Yeah.
And people always wondered, why does he charge in with a riding crop or a golden cane and not a sword? But his job is just kind of to lead the pack, right? He's not there to fight one-on-one with another cavalryman.
That's absolutely right. I mean, his job is to motivate and lead everyone forwards. What happens next really is, it's down to everyone else. But Eylau was a very difficult situation that he rescued and turned the tables.
Mm-hmm.
And you also get even later on in his career, even at somewhere like Leipzig, Murat doesn't exactly he doesn't turn the battle around, but at key points he really pushes the Allies right back in disorder. And
Mm-hmm.
it might have gone differently, who knows? But he does his bit. He's always doing his bit. Who knows? I mean, we can talk about the counterfactuals of what would it have been like had he been at Waterloo, but
Right.
He wasn't. So,
and that's not to say he always performed well. The 1812 invasion of Russia was not his finest moment, but that can be said of almost every officer in the Grand Armée outside of Marshal Ney. Do you think, obviously he's trying to save his crown because eventually he leaves the Russian, the French army in Russia and goes back to Italy. Do you think this is when he really started to doubt Napoleon's future?
That in a way, yes, but there'd been some tensions before that. So Napoleon had this way of ruling Europe through family and through appointing family members to the throne of different satellite kingdoms. Murat and Caroline, King and Queen of Naples, and as soon as they became King and Queen of Naples, they assumed that they would be allowed to rule with a measure of autonomy and independence. I mean, this is also the case with other members of Napoleon's family, that they assumed they'd be allowed to get on with it, but Napoleon had other ideas. And so you already have this tension between them as king and queen, and Napoleon really wanting to manage and dictate terms. And that was emerging 1810, 1811. Coming on our way to Russia, I think, on the surface is just another huge Napoleonic campaign. And Murat was flattered to be taking part. And in the early stages, it went well. You can already see by the time it gets to Smolensk that a lot of the marshals, not just Murat, are saying, we shouldn't really go much further. This is a good point to stop. What's he doing? It's Napoleon that really takes the decision to push them on to Moscow. And of course, when Moscow burns down and winter's coming, in that menacing phrase, plenty of marshals are starting to think, well, this isn't a great idea. And Murat, he's in charge of the vanguard, which is outside Moscow, and they're completely deprived of supplies. No one sends them any fodder, any food from Moscow. They have to fend for themselves. And if you look at Murat's letters, and they're just really despairing. I mean, this is before the retreat even starts.
Right.
They're really dispirited. They want peace. They want to be out of there. They don't think this is a good idea. And then, of course, you've got the horrific retreat all the way back to Poland and Prussia. And Murat does, at the first time, really falters in his career. He, in early 1813 or late 1812, he is given command of what's left of the army as Napoleon heads back to Paris. And Murat just washes his hands, hands it all in, and goes off to Italy. So, that's a really bad sign.
Yeah, and he gets back to Italy. He maintains his throne, but yet again, Napoleon beckons him to come to Dresden, and grumblingly so, Murat agrees to go and help out, and they have a huge victory there.
Yeah,
but then they have a terrible loss at Leipzig. After which, the two men never see each other again, which it's kind of sad, don't you think?
It is sad. Yeah, I mean, they've been companions have been at each other's side more or less for many long years. Murat has a little flash of glory in 1813, which can't really be said about many marshals in that campaign. But like many, he's ready for peace.
Well, let's discuss his wife and Napoleon's sister, Caroline Bonaparte, who's been called the most Machiavellian of the family, but with her constant scheming. Did she just not like her husband or her brother? Was she just looking out for herself only? Like, what was her? If you got inside her head, what was she doing?
Well, she's a relatively young Bonaparte. I think she's the seventh child, and she's born in 1782. So she's quite young. She's ambitious, definitely. I mean, let's look at the Bonapartes and find one who isn't ambitious. But anyway,
True.
She's educated. She has a good, sound political head. And I think that when people say scheming, actually, for a lot of people in those days, in that time, it just meant a woman who's quite good at politics. Because actually politics is scheming, it's intrigue, it's, navigating your way through situations. That is scheming. But if a man does it, that's not scheming. But anyway,
good point.
So scheming perhaps is a bit unfair, but she was very savvy. She was very good, and I think really being made Queen of Naples, that really flattered her ambition. But also she had some ideas, and she came to that role with energy, charged in. And she was actually quite good at it. Murat was away in 1812 in Russia for a long time, and she managed the crown at Naples quite well. So she was pretty sound, pretty reliable. She did have some tensions with her husband because her husband was loyal follower of Napoleon, and she had ideas that, well, we've been given this kingdom, we have to run it for ourselves, for the Neapolitans, not for Napoleon. So there's some tension there, and also obviously some tension with her brother Napoleon about similar things. And by 1811, Murat and his wife are insisting on any French employee in Naples becoming Neapolitan citizens, and they were promoting people, and Napoleon was going, what are you doing? I don't like this person. You're not supposed to be doing that. I'm in charge. She was a really good partner for Murat. Perhaps if he was given to rash decisions, she was, she kind of kept the purse strings a little bit, and kept a bit like the neck. He was the head, and she was the neck.
Yeah. And she was a good political operator, but I know this next bit is where I believe her mom stopped talking to her.
Yes.
In 1814, Murat and Caroline accepted a deal to save their throne, and they turned their army against Napoleon and Prince Eugene's army in Italy. Napoleon's star was clearly fading, but there were still many who stayed loyal to the emperor until the very end.
Yeah.
What do you think Murat should have done here?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think it's a very, very difficult situation he found himself in. I think it might not have saved his throne, but the decent thing to have done would have been to support Prince Eugene in northern Italy. I think that would have been better for his legacy. It would have been the honourable thing to do. It probably wouldn't have saved his throne, and it probably wouldn't have allowed Eugene to remain sort of in the field for very much longer, because all the big decisions were being made in France and around Paris in 1814, and Napoleon's defeat really meant the defeat of Prince Eugene as well. So from a practical point of view, Murat's assistance probably wouldn't have made that much difference. But from the moral point of view, what Murat did was very wrong. But if you see it from his point of view and the point of view of Caroline, then they were negotiating to save their throne, and the Allies seemed, well, to go along with it a little bit. Not exactly supportive, but say, well, yeah, if you do this, then we'll look after you, make sure everything's okay. Now, what we know about the Allies, I don't think that you should take their word at face value.
Right.
Somebody called the British perfidious, and I don't say that that's entirely wrong. And in fact, the British were very keen to get the Bourbon royal family of Naples back on the Neapolitan throne. That royal family was in Sicily, had been all the time Murat was on the throne. They had these Bourbon rivals in Sicily waiting to come back. The British were very keen that that happen. The Austrians were very keen that Austrian dominance of Italy extended all the way down too. So sort of the British and the Austrians could disagree, and Murat might, had he been a little bit more canny, have played them against each other a little bit. But you know, when Napoleon's defeated and gone, all the odds are stacked against you. But I mean, Murat's contribution to the defeat of Prince Eugene by moving up to Rome and then sort of menacing Prince Eugene's rear, it wasn't a good thing to be doing. Might not have made much difference, but it just said to every Frenchman and every Bonapartist that this is we've been betrayed.
It's interesting though, because you generally hear when you talk about betrayers of Napoleon, you hear names like Marmont and Bernadotte, but Murat was just as culpable as those other two guys. But maybe just because he didn't do it. I don't know why he doesn't get that label as much as the other two.
I think it's very true. It's a good point. I think he very much was a betrayer at that point in time. And it might be just the subsequent sad demise overshadows that a little bit, and people start to sympathize with them a bit more. But I think at the time, we'll probably come on to when Murat leaves Naples and ends up in France. But what happened really was that a lot of those in the French army saw Murat as a traitor.
Yeah, and we'll come to that here in a second. In 1815, Napoleon returns from Elba for the 100 Days campaign, and in a show of fidelity, Murat rashly attacks the Austrian army at Tolentino. And even though he has a larger force, he loses the battle and his crown, and has to flee first to Corsica and then to France. And then what happens from there? I know he goes to Napoleon. Well, he doesn't meet him in person, but does he send a letter to him, say, "Hey, I want to make amends," or what is he trying to do there?
He does. It's a very interesting story, and it really forms the basis of much of the book that you kindly mentioned. I think actually Murat in 1815 is a great story in itself. So Napoleon escapes from Elba, and Murat fields an army of about 50,000 men. He manages to put together quite a big army, marches northwards and proclaims, and this is what a lot of people in the English-speaking world tend to forget, Murat proclaimed Italian unity and independence. So there's a proclamation that he made at Rimini, where he says basically, you know, we're all Italians. I don't know how he got away with that because he was born in France, but anyway, we're all Italians. Rise up, rise up. But I think that Italy was a bit tired of war by then, and there were some volunteers, but generally there was no big rising against the Austrians. Maybe in 10 years' time there would have been, but 1815, everyone's sick of war. And so Murat finds himself against a much larger Austrian army, methodically moving south through Italy, faces them at Tolentino. On the first day of Tolentino, he does very, very well and just nearly wins. But the second day, the appetite's gone out of the Neapolitans, and it's a disaster. And the army breaks up and runs and flees. And Murat comes all the way back down to his capital and realizes that the game is up. No one's going to keep him on the throne of Naples anymore. And he does a very strange thing. At that point, he's pretty desperate, and his first idea is to go to a fortress on the coast between Naples and Rome called Gaeta. It's a very strong fortress, and he's thinking to lock himself up there. He gets onto some boats, but the Royal Navy, British Royal Navy, is already off the coast. And instead of going to Gaeta, he actually goes to France. And the point at which he arrives, so this is May 1815, Napoleon back on the throne, emperor again. He's getting ready for the likely war with the Allies. And Murat just turns up in the south of France, looking a bit disheveled, in civilian clothes, no more grand uniforms and yellow boots.
Right.
And Murat's looking really for a job. And the interesting thing is that when Murat comes, there are a couple, he brings some officers with him. And there are a lot of duels fought in Marseille between Murat's officers and men and those in the French army, because the French army is very angry with Murat for betraying France
as it should be.
the year before.
Yeah.
So Murat is very much in the doghouse at that point. He does write to Napoleon, and he uses his friend Fouché, the arch intriguer, Fouché, to try and get Napoleon's ear. But Napoleon too is quite capable of bearing grudges, which might surprise people, and it doesn't want anything to do with Murat.
He is Napoleon, certainly, but I've also, in dealing with like the King of Austria, he's forgiven him 3 times. So I know he can forgive grudges.
Yeah.
So do you think Napoleon should have forgiven him and taken him to Waterloo?
I think it's probably hindsight that makes us think that, just because we know what happens next. But I think probably the transgression was just too much for there to be a quick forgiveness. I think what Napoleon was planning was to be on the throne much longer, and it would be a gradual return to favor.
Right.
And for that, really, Caroline had to be there, and she wasn't. She'd stayed in Naples. She'd negotiated with the British. The British said, "Yeah, we'll help you." Then the Austrians came, and the British said, "Oh, they'll look after you," and they took her off to Austria. So she didn't come with Murat. He came by himself, and he had to do his special pleading himself. And he had to do that in a part of France that wasn't very friendly to Napoleon. So the area around Marseille, Toulon, was quite royalist still. It wasn't the most enthusiastic Bonapartist area. So there's that sort of undercurrent of danger, Murat staying down there. So he was very aware that he needed to move out of the south of France. And ideally, that would be to come and lead, to come and join Napoleon. But he also suggested, look, I could take care of the army of Italy. If you want to send troops into Italy, I could do that. And in a way that he's sort of suggesting, I think, you could help me get back on my throne of Naples and we could just start again.
Yeah, you wonder, too, Napoleon at Waterloo mentioned if he could have just broken 1 or 2 British squares, which he thinks Murat could have done. But even that's Monday morning quarterback. That's even if they'd won at Waterloo, they probably would have lost overall. So, it probably doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think that, I think it's an interesting thing to play with, but we'll never know.
Yeah. Now, obviously, Napoleon loses. He's shipped off again, this time finally to St. Helena for his final exile.
Yes.
And what does Murat do from there?
So really, with Napoleon marching off to Waterloo in June 1815, Murat's still left down in the south. He moves up a little bit inland, and a few more of his officers come over from Naples, and he has a little sort of mini court in exile. But after Waterloo, Napoleon's whole power structure collapse, and the royalists are very quick to take over the ports in the south of France with some British help. And basically what begins then is it's often called the White Terror, where the royalists start settling scores. So, I mean, everyone's heard of Marshal Brune's. Not everyone's heard of it. It was relatively obscure, but Marshal Brune was another Napoleon's marshals who was killed, assassinated at Avignon in August 1815. He wasn't the only example of a Napoleonic officer who was done in and killed, because there was a settling of scores, vengeance, and there was a price placed on Murat's head. So he really realized he had to get out of there pretty quick. And what he determined to do was to go to Corsica. And Corsica was one part of France that was difficult to get to, difficult to rule, difficult to manage, and wasn't royalist. So he managed to, in a very dramatic way, take a ship over in disguise, got over to Corsica, where he found some friends. I mean, it's not particularly well known, but when he was king of Naples, he had a lot of Corsican troops. So Naples had a couple of regiments that were composed of Corsicans. The Guard had a lot of Corsican officers. So there was quite a little Murat fan club in Corsica.
You can almost see the germination or the inception of his idea, kind of watching Napoleon just land on a beach and take over the country again without firing a shot. Like,
absolutely.
I mean, he probably should have just gone to America and hidden out there for a few years.
He should have done, but I think, you know, Napoleon doing that, had Murat succeeded, we would be talking about him as, you know, this fantastic hero.
True.
And that it didn't work out that way. It's bad luck, bad planning, or so many reasons. But basically, from Corsica, he managed to put together, by borrowing money, put together an expedition of about 250 men, 6 little ships, and they set off in September 1815. And it's not entirely clear what Murat's plan was, but it seems like he'd been told that there were plenty of people in Naples who were just waiting for him to show up. And they would rise and support him. And he was getting this information from former army officers who I think perhaps were indulging in a bit of wishful thinking. And Murat, well, he believed.
No, it must have been a very humbling time that he has to kind of hide out in civilian clothing. He doesn't know where he's sleeping from night to night. He's fighting duels against people who want to kill him. So it must have been.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty scary having come from the throne of Naples where everyone, you know, treats you with respect.
Right.
And then to be very disappointed in his native country, because, as I say, Murat is French, to be treated so badly in your native country. He was very keen to go back to Naples. And I think that he was perhaps more optimistic about his reception than he should have been, particularly because he landed in Calabria. And Calabria was one of the regions of the Kingdom of Naples. It's the sort of the toe of Italy. It's one of the regions that Murat had spent 5 long years putting down banditry with quite some brutality, and he wasn't very popular in Calabria. He and his police and gendarmes had spent a lot of time hanging young men if they found weapons at home and things like that. So it's maybe the worst part of his kingdom to go to.
Yeah, and you know, his time in Madrid, he could be quite harsh putting down.
It could be quite harsh, yeah. I mean, it's something that he did, and in fact, most rulers of Naples were pretty harsh towards what was quite a big problem in southern Italy, bandits and insurgents. And so he really ended up on a beach in Calabria. Now, there'd been a storm, unfortunately, and of his 6 boats, I think it was only one actually made it through the bad weather. And so he landed with about 29 people, including 2 valets and a cook. So I don't know what he was planning, but it wasn't exactly a coup.
Right.
And he found himself on the beach. At that point, it's not entirely clear what he planned to do, but he marched up into the little town of this, into a little square of this town called Pisa in Calabria, and said, "I'm your king. I have returned." And everyone just looked at him and thought, God.
Yeah, this
And
guy. Yeah.
there's this really awkward silence, and then a couple of royalist officers put together a group of people, hand out some weapons. They chase him through an olive grove, gets down to the beach, has a big punch up, a very violent little episode, and Murat gets captured.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's captured almost as soon as he lands. And again, the Bourbons are ruling the country now. So what happens from here?
Yeah, he's captured very, very quickly. His followers are also caught in the woods. They get taken up to Pisa, put in a castle in the prison. A couple of days later, word gets to Naples, and the king decides there's only one thing we can do. We have to execute him. He's a troublemaker. And there's a kind of mock trial. The difficulty is, in a way, that Murat is a French citizen, is a French general, but he's also a king. So Murat doesn't recognize the court. It's a court martial.
Right.
They've scraped together some officers from the garrison. So it's a kind of very bodged, very mismanaged court.
Yeah, that's one of those, give him a fair trial and then have him shot.
Exactly. I mean, you know the outcome. Let's just get on with it.
Yeah.
And so they decide to shoot him. I think he's possibly the first king shot by firing squad. I think
Really?
that's one of the things that is odd about Murat. But they take him out onto the castle. There's a little sort of courtyard in the castle. Now, everybody that knows anything about this episode knows that Murat spoke to the firing squad and said, "Spare the face, shoot at the heart."
Yeah.
Which is a great story, but it turns out it's not true. So it's one of the disappointments of history. But
he does refuse a blindfold, though, correct?
He does refuse a blindfold. He does refuse a chair. He is very brave. He hands out his watch. He puts his hand on his chest, and he says more or less, aim true or aim accurately, and open fire. And they do that, and he's instantly killed. But even then, they go over and shoot him in the head with a pistol. That night he's taken off down to the town, and he's thrown into a common grave under the church in Pisa.
And no matter what you think of the man, I mean, he did have a family, he had children, he had a wife, so it is kind of sad that he ended up in this way.
It's very sad. In fact, one of the mysteries of Murat is his body's not really been identified, because in the 1830s there was a cholera epidemic in Calabria. A lot of people died, and they threw hundreds of bodies into this common grave where Murat was. And all the bones got mixed up together, and they've never really been able to extricate or find his body. So they know he's there, but it's a very sad little story.
Well, and this is a tricky question, but it's, what is the legacy of General Marshal Prince King Murat?
Yeah, I think the legacy really is that he's one of those very strange stories of commoner who becomes a king. And when he becomes a king, tries to enact policies and reforms that are modernizing and progressive. So I don't mean that in a modern way, but for those people familiar with the history of Naples, before the Napoleonic decade, when Napoleonic rule of Naples began, it was had a lot of potential. It was very culturally rich, but economically desperate, badly mismanaged, horrendous legal system, horrendous corruption, dominated by the church, dominated by this awful family of Bourbons. And when first it's Joseph Bonaparte and then Murat, when those people come in, they really modernize the state. They do look at France and take the best of French reforms and impose them on Naples. They abolish feudalism. They reform land ownership. They sell a lot of church land. They really improve the administration of the state.
Right.
And I don't think people outside of Italy really appreciate that and the effect that had on subsequent Italian history. And the other thing about Murat and legacy is that episode in 1815 when he rides up to Rimini and issues a proclamation saying we're all Italians, we should be united. That's pretty much the first time anybody's done that.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that in 1815, and we've got Garibaldi coming along in 1860. That was a very significant moment in Italian history. That it was launched by a Frenchman, but still, the birth of that idea, the development of that idea, that really is part of Murat's legacy.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That spark of Garibaldi may have been started in 1815.
Yeah, I mean, look at Garibaldi. He showed up with a handful, well, it was 1,000, but it's still a handful. It's a big handful of supporters, and he was able to overthrow a kingdom. Murat tried, he didn't manage, but still, it's a similar kind of impossible adventure.
Yeah, it's almost mercurial or like Icarus flying to the sun, but it's really, in a lot of ways, it's inspiring because he's, like you said, he's the 11th son of an innkeeper.
Yeah.
And he had a pretty darn good life.
Yeah, I think it's inspirational. I think it's very interesting. The more you look at it, I think the more reward you get. I also have to say there's a bit of an American connection too. I know you're in Florida, but
I am.
Murat's son, Akil, so the family, Murat's executed, and the family is kind of kept in this kind of Austrian exile by the Austrians, where they say, "Oh, come stay with us. You want to leave? No, you can't leave." And they more or less live out their life there. The Austrians are very worried they'll go back to Italy. But anyway, Murat's eldest son, Akil, he runs off to America and he ends up living in Florida.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, so not probably too far from you. Well,
I read that. Yeah, he had some land here, and it's the Murat legacy here in Florida.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a global family.
Yeah, indeed. And in the book, there's a lot more detail on is it pretty much what is the main time period in the book?
It's a very focused. So the main time period is from May 1815 when Murat, having been defeated at Tolentino in northern Italy, comes back to Naples, puts together some money, takes a few of his key supporters, and goes down to the coast in an attempt to get away, and thinking that he'll be able to continue the war, but actually he ends up in France. So it's really from that period, May, to the firing squad in October 1815. So what's that, sort of 6 months?
Yep, and that's right. October 1815 is when he was killed. But he also doesn't get enough credit. He was one of the best marshals, in my opinion. Really talented leader of men.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, if you want to look at that band of, 26?
26.
soldiers, then he stands out not just because of the boots and the hat. But he stands out as really being sort of a chivalrous opponent. I think everyone could look at his talent as a leader of cavalry, leader of men, but actually as an opponent, there's something a bit like a knight about him. There's something that he was generous. He wasn't nasty or vindictive or anything like that. That if you were facing Murat, you were facing an honourable opponent. I think
Yeah.
that these are positives.
Yeah, and I think even the marshals who despised him, Davout and Ney and Lan, they still respected him and what he could do.
Yeah, I think so too. I think Napoleon. Well, Napoleon said a lot of things from St. Helena when he was in exile. Not all of them flattering, but I think he was perhaps a little bit unfair towards Murat. But that's coloured by the end of their relationship rather than the beginning. I think if you'd asked Napoleon about Murat in 1805, it would have been a very different story.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I appreciate that story, Jonathan. That was amazing. And again, I'd like to tell my listeners the website is jpisandpaulnorth.co.uk. Please check out his website and find a number of books there. And yeah, I appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much indeed.